Welcome to this session on focus groups. You should be listening to this lecture after listening to the lecture on interviews. So it's Jenny Kitzinger here. So this is going to be a brief introduction to focus groups with an idea of their definition, why they might be useful, and the basic steps to conduct them to lead into the further reading that you can do under your own steam. So, a focus group, at its most basic, is a group interview. It simply means talking with several people at once in a research context. Now, a proper focus group is not just a group interview, though. It uses the fact that you are interviewing people in a group, and that means, for example, encouraging them to talk with one another and being attentive to group dynamics. It's focused in the sense that the researcher asks questions and attempts to keep the response on topic, though you can be fairly relaxed sometimes and see if the group dynamics raise issues that maybe you hadn't anticipated as being relevant to your research question. On the other hand, you don't want them just to sit round discussing COVID-19 or a soap opera if that's not the focus of your own research. The group composition is usually between 4 to 10 people. Any less than 4 and it's not really good for group dynamics. Any more than 10 and it's really quite hard to manage. Although I always advise people to over-recruit because there'll be some people who don't turn up. So if you only want 4 people, recruit 6. It's important to strike a balance between having a group which is too small for interactions and one is just so big that it becomes impossible to manage. When you're pulling your group together, try and avoid hierarchies that might silence anyone. You really want everyone to be able to speak freely, and in that sense, actually pulling them together because they have a shared experience is really positive and can help both discussion flow freely, but also help people unpack their feelings, their experiences, their thinking in interaction with one another. So you do have a choice about whether to use artificially created groups or go to a pre-existing group, a naturally occurring group. I certainly favour that last type, a naturally occurring group. So people who already know each other. That could be a family group, that could be members of the same club, it could be members of a workplace. Or students, of course, who have been doing the same course. So when might you use focus groups? They're really good for looking at a range of ideas or feelings that people have about something. So it might be their view of a TV program, how they use social media, their attitudes towards something like mental illness or their understanding of COVID-19. And you're looking for a range of ideas and feelings, but you might, of course, access that range through the way you sample between groups, that you have lots of different groups representing different types of stakeholders who might, you hypothesize, bring a different perspective to the issue. So if you were doing a focus group discussion about media coverage of COVID-19, for example, you might want to talk to a group of doctors, except bear in mind they're rather busy at the moment. Ditto, you might want to talk to some nurses. You might want to talk to people who've had COVID-19. You might want to talk to people over 70 because there are specific messages about COVID-19 and people over 70. So you theoretically think about what might be important variations and then try and make sure you talk to these different groups to get the range of views. You're trying to understand differences in perspectives between groups or sometimes between categories of people. And you want to often use the focus group to try and uncover factors that influence opinions, behaviours or motivations. So, for example, what messages have people taken in that's making them socially isolate well, or perhaps break some of the social isolation guidelines. And you really want ideas to emerge in a group that might be less likely to come out in an individual interview. That's the kind of magic of focus groups. And that's sometimes hard to predict, but by attentive listening to the group, probing questions, inviting them to debate one another, that's when you can sometimes access these kind of new ways of speaking that wouldn't come out in the individual one-to-one interview. And as you watch the group and listen to the group, you're also observing how people learn. How do they respond to new information presented in the group, for example? How do they make meaning or form opinions? So sometimes in a group discussion, you might actually see people argue, and some people begin to shift their position or change their minds. That's very, very different from an interview setup. And that's where it can be really fascinating to pay close attention to try and understand what's going on. The method also allows researchers to examine the dynamic relationship of people's attitudes and beliefs, so how they sometimes change in relation to new information. So to give an example from my own work, I did a large focus group study, over 50 focus groups, way more than you could do. But I was working on this for 3 years with the outbreak of the AIDS epidemic. So when AIDS first appeared, it was an unknown disease. People weren't sure how it was transmitted. It had a high mortality rate. And it was really seen as a kind of plague. And it was often associated with being a gay man or a drug user, in fact. So there was a lot of homophobia and discrimination in the coverage, a lot of problematic headlines. And I was part of a movement at that time, both in my activism and in my research work, to try to understand what was going on as we got to grips with this new threat, this unknown threat to human health. I worked with a team with David Miller and Kevin Williams, both of whom are now professors at other universities, but we were co-researchers back then on this project about AIDS. And we looked at what we called the circuit of mass communication, the production of messages about AIDS, the content of the media coverage, and then reception. And it's interesting to see how we mobilized all the methods you've learned about in this course. So to look at the production of media messages, we conducted interviews with health communicators, politicians, journalists, and people designing advertising campaigns. And we asked them about what messages they were trying to get out there. In the content analysis, we looked at soap opera representations, advertising campaigns, and news coverage, and analysed the words and language and narratives being used in the representation of AIDS. And then to understand reception of AIDS media messages, that's where we used focus groups to explore how people were making sense of what they were hearing and how those ideas were circulating in group discussions among families, colleagues, friendship groups. And we produced a book called The Circuit of Mass Communication in the AIDS Crisis, and there are chapters in that unpack the findings from the focus groups, highlighting, for example, the role of stigmatizing groups and feeling that if you kept away from certain types of people, you would stay safe from AIDS, or that if you weren't a certain type of person, you couldn't possibly get it. So there was the fantasy, the illusion that if you were heterosexual, you couldn't get AIDS, for example. And there was quite a push towards the campaign for safer sex, particularly condom use at that time. And we also found widespread misunderstanding of transmission, and that rather than rely on official information from scientists and health educators about how AIDS was transmitted, there was a massive circulation of myths, mythologies about transmission that weren't true. And I hope as you're listening to this, you can begin to think whether there are some differences or overlapping similarities in what is happening with COVID-19 now. Clearly, two differences that I can think of immediately are that COVID-19 can be transmitted easily in a way that AIDS cannot be. Well, HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, cannot be transmitted easily. Whereas everything we're being told about COVID-19, it does seem that that's easy to transmit without intimate contact or exchange of body fluids. And the other big difference is, of course, we are now in the 21st century where social media is really important. So if I was going to repeat the kind of work I did in the 1980s about AIDS and apply that to the current situation, I'd need to take into account the way in which being an audience has changed, and particularly the role of social media. So there are lots of values in doing focus groups, and I really love them. I find them a very exciting and interesting way of collecting data. There are also challenges. So practically, you need to get people into the same space, or at least into the same time frame if you're doing a focus group online. And of course, one of the things that may get affected by COVID-19 is the ability to go out and do fieldwork face-to-face in person. So we're likely to be doing more online research, at least in the near future. Focus groups can also be more challenging for researchers. You have to think on your feet. You have to be able to process a lot during the discussion, to take in what everyone is saying and to respond flexibly in your questions and probes. I often ask people whether they come from a large and lively family or not, because I tend to find with my research assistants that if they come from a large family, they're much more able quickly to adapt to running focus group discussions, whereas people who are only children sometimes find it harder. So think about your own skill set, how easy you find it to multitask, to listen to lots of people talking at once, to deal with group dynamics, and use that to consider whether this is a method for you. I'm generalising a bit there about your family background, so don't let me put you off if you're an only child and want to do focus groups. There is a skill involved as well about engaging with the group dynamics if they're not going well. So you don't want a situation where there's just a couple of individuals talking in the focus groups and nobody else is talking, and you need to be able to intervene to change that. You also, certainly in the focus groups I've run around AIDS, you sometimes have to deal with offensive comments, bullying, discrimination in the group, and decide how you're going to manage that if it feels targeted particularly at a member of the group. So focus groups are sort of unruly. I like the unruly focus group, but they are unruly. They're much harder to control than a one-to-one interview. And when you listen to any group discussion, it's hard to isolate and freeze a kind of set of attitudes as conventionally conceptualized. It's not like you can do a tick box afterwards and say, well, 3 people thought X and 2 people thought Y. You can't turn it into a kind of quantitative quasi-survey data. People also often come across as inconsistent and self-contradictory. And the discussions are full of discontinuities and deviation. And group participants interrupt each other, they complete each other's sentences. They can often kind of shift role in a way that they're less likely to do in a formal interview. They can be playful, they can perform roles, they can say things just to wind each other up. And they can take on a devil's advocate position, tell stories or jokes, or even in some of the focus groups I've run, people have ended up singing songs. So I've written about this in my book called Developing Focus Group Research. That's a co-edited book looking at the politics, theory and practice of focus groups. And I think it's still a worthwhile book to go to. It pulls together a collection of different people's experiences of running focus groups in different settings. And they're a fantastic collection of researchers, and they sometimes kind of overcome what you might think are obstacles. So people tend to think focus groups aren't necessarily good for sensitive discussion, but you'll certainly see a couple of chapters in that book that says a skilled researcher or a researcher with a lot of knowledge about that sensitive area, maybe because they're an insider to that sensitive area themselves, can actually do really powerful and effective focus groups. So I've certainly used focus groups to talk with people about childhood sexual abuse, for example. But I wouldn't recommend that unless you are very, very knowledgeable and very experienced. So whatever you do, try and match what your skill set is to the risks you take with your method. And that's only responsible and ethical as we get involved with research participants. So it's often impossible to isolate the individual voice from the stream of group debate. You just have to acknowledge that as the reality in focus group discussions and not fight it, really. I mean, you might sometimes go back to participants and say, oh, can I just come back to you and ask you to finish your sentence? Or when this other member of the focus group said that and finished your sentence for you, is that what you meant? So you want to clarify, but not suppress that kind of mutual construction of a conversation. So the data is quite dynamic and shifty, and it's quite hard to abstract it from its context. And in that sense, it's contextually rich and contextually embedded information. And just accept that, and that's how you treat it. That's its value. In fact, what I tend to say is when you're looking at the troublesome aspects of focus groups, the difficulties, the challenges, in a way, that's the grit in the oyster that produces the pearl. Those aspects of the focus groups are what are their greatest strengths. And what I find with focus groups, they create a research site which allows me to go beyond a sort of static notion of what people know or their attitudes, and to explore instead how we think through our mouths. We think as we say, and we construct arguments and debates and discussions. So rather than thinking that how people talk is a kind of direct access to something real that exists in their brain and can be ticked off in a very quantitative and objective way, with the focus group, we're more thinking about how do people talk, how do they debate, how do they navigate, how are they deploying information, what memories do they have, and how do they bring those to the conversation. So just at a practical level, you need to think about your key steps in focus group research. Decide why the focus groups are the right data collection technique for your research question, and, as I've already suggested, for you as a researcher. Decide on your sample. Who is it you want to talk to? And in what sort of combinations? So what's the composition of your focus groups? And what's going to be the diversity of the focus groups you seek out? You might well want to do 3 or 4 focus groups. Are they going to represent different types of stakeholders, different types of people? And how are you going to decide that? And of course, consider the practicalities. For example, the COVID-19 epidemic means that your focus groups are likely to have to be held online for the foreseeable future, if that's the way you go. You need to work out the practicalities. How are you and the participants going to access the technology to join the group? How are you going to recruit people? And will people want to join in and actually do so on the day? And if not, you may need to recruit. You need an information sheet for participants. As with any research using human participants, they need to have a quick summary of what it is you're doing, why you're collecting the data, and what you're going to do with it. And usually a consent form that they sign as well, confirming that they've read the information and have agreed to participate. You're going to need a set of questions, your own guide, your own schedule. So in a previous lecture, I talked about your interview schedule. In the same way, you need a focus group schedule, which is your list of questions that you're going to be running through, and try and at least make sure you've asked all those questions in each focus group, even if you end up doing some more probing spontaneously, maybe deviating a little, maybe adding in some questions. But there'll be some core questions you want to get through. You need to decide how you're going to record the discussion, audio only or audio visual. It's of course much easier just to do audio, and people are often more comfortable with that. Are you going to type up those discussions or just listen through and take notes? That depends a bit on your analysis technique. And of course, you're going to need ethics consent. So thinking ahead towards analysing your data, you're going to want to make sense and find patterns and differences in your raw data. You can use software packages which search out particular keywords in your transcript, but I wouldn't really recommend that for a small project at this stage. I think I'd stick to making sure you had deep knowledge of your data. Transcribing is good, using coloured highlighters to pull out themes is good, making sure you've systematically paid attention to all the data and not just cherry-picked. You can set up categories and code them. So with my AIDS work, for example, one category was stigma. Were there dismissive or discriminatory comments about certain groups of people? Would be one code. Another code would be everything that was said about transmission routes. So if somebody said that when they came to a Pelican Crossing, they wouldn't push the button with their finger for fear of AIDS, but would always pull down their sleeve and push the Pelican button with a finger, I'd code that as something being said here about routes of transmission. Or if somebody else said, well, you can't get it from heterosexual sex, it's only gays who get it, HIV doesn't affect heterosexuals, again, I would code that as a statement about transmission. You can split up the transcripts by questions or subjects. So especially if focus groups have been quite good about sticking to your questions and actually answering them, you may find you can go across your 4 transcripts from your 4 different focus groups and look at the response to each question you asked across the 4, and that would be a useful way of comparing. So that's been a very fast introduction to focus groups to make sure you've got that basic understanding in your toolkit. As with all the other methods, your in-depth engagement with this method depends on your further reading. And I've put up some references here. They're also in the module handout. So the Brennan book on qualitative research methods in media studies, which is online, includes a chapter on online focus groups and a discussion about focus group research in general, but engages with the issue of online focus groups. So I think that's a good update. Some of the older references going back to the 90s are really good about face-to-face focus groups, and I recommend them because it's worth having a look at them to see what you're trying to achieve before you then update and interpret that in the context of online work, if that's what you decide to do. And I'd certainly recommend doing a Google Scholar search or the Web of Science, whatever database you use, to look at what other people have done with online focus groups in the kind of area that you're interested in, so that you're not just reading the theoretical accounts of this, but you're actually accessing articles where people have used this in their own research, and you can see in practice how it worked for them. Okay, I hope that's been a useful introduction, and good luck with the way you progress this. I do hope some of you do decide to use focus groups. As I say, it can be a lot of fun. And next time you're in any kind of group setting, even if it's a Zoom party, just begin to notice whether there's a difference between that and maybe when you just sit with a friend one-to-one. Obviously, these aren't research contexts, but what is the difference between a one-to-one encounter and a group encounter?